AJ, have you ever seen a sage grouse before?
I have. I've hunted them in Montana. I can remember how insane it was to see them for the first time, a group of mature males. I was filming at that exact moment, not shooting, but I was awestruck by how massive they were. It's very obvious of why people call those big males bombers.
They really are huge. I've had the privilege of hunting them in Wyoming, and they really couldn't be a more beautiful bird. They're an incredible symbol of sagebrush ecosystems.
Sage grouse in general represent a powder keg in the fight over environmental issues. The complexity of the topic lends itself to challenges that have been met in national politics. So instead of tackling all of sage grouse issues all at once, here we'll hone into a specific region, in this case, the Great Basin in western Utah.
And as you'll learn in this episode, not all sage grouse habitat is created equal. The topic of sage grouse conservation spans across 9 states and a small portion of southern Canada, and each place comes with its own unique issues.
This is a great example of how funding for science, federal and state agencies, big wild spaces, and the expertise of academia is essential to not only how we succeed going forward, but also how we know so much already today. As we will learn in this episode, science can solve and mitigate many game species issues.
We will also have an unlikely appearance from a non-game bird that has a stake in this story as well, the pinyon jay.
My name is AJ DeRosa, co-host of the Project Upland podcast and founder of Project Upland.
And I'm Gabby Zaldambide, the editor-in-chief of Project Upland magazine and AJ's co-host.
This podcast series is an immersive experience that travels through time, stretches across landscapes, and delivers on the independent storytelling you have come to love.
Listen in as we learn from researchers, biologists, and subject matter experts about birds, nature, conservation, dogs, and more. This is a glimpse into the crazy minds of the folks at Project Upland and the stories that do not always make it to print.
A simple action like rating, reviewing, and subscribing has a huge impact on our small business. If you want to support our independent media further, head over to our Patreon, where you will find behind-the-scenes content, full-length interviews, resources, and even interact with us.
Join us as we travel into the deepest, most obscure, and nerdiest realms of the uplands.
These are your stories.
When in full plumage, he is a beautiful bird with a long, firm, sharp-pointed tail, which in walking is slightly raised and swings sidewise back and forth with each step. The male is handsomely marked with black and white on the neck, back, and wings, weighs 5 or 6 pounds, and measures about 30 inches in length. The female is clad mostly in plain brown and is not so large. They occasionally wander from the sage plains into the open nut pine and juniper woods, but never enter the main coniferous forest. It is only in the broad, dry, half-desert sage plains that they are quite at home, where the weather is blazing hot in summer, cold in winter. December 1898, John Muir.
The sound you are hearing is a male sage grouse during their courtship display on a lek in the springtime. A large male can push the scales at 7 pounds. This makes them the largest of North America's native grouse species. They are a game bird that gets a lot of attention, and not just from hunters or for how impressive they are, but because of where and how they live.
Before we go any further, let's first learn some background information about the greater sage grouse from a species expert, Dave Dahlgren.
Most people I work with, like agency-wise and stuff, they're sick of talking about sage grouse. I love them still, and I could talk about them all day. My name's David Dahlgren. I'm an associate professor and rangeland wildlife extension specialist at Utah State University. So the greater sage grouse occupies, or at least historically occupied, most of western North America where we had sagebrush systems. We've lost about half of our sage grouse habitat in the western U.S., and thus this species kind of represents this bigger biome. And some people might use the word umbrella species. And so it's really a representation of this. There's over 300 wildlife species of some sort use or are dependent on the sagebrush system. So that's really the bigger issue with sage grouse.
Dave has been working with sage grouse since the early 2000s. In fact, sage grouse research is his bread and butter. Through his work, he's learned some truly incredible things about sage grouse, including just how much space they require to survive. This is about lots of space, and Dave has really pinned down a very black and white scientific explanation of how much space sage grouse need to survive.
If you think of a lek, okay, so a lek's a single point on the map, right? And you draw a 20-mile buffer, okay? So a 20-mile radius around that lek. So now you got this big circle, and then you look at that's creating an area now, right? If 25% or less of that circle, that buffer, is sagebrush, 25% or less, chance of that lek persisting is 0. It's not going to persist, okay? Between 20% and 50% of that buffer being dominated by sagebrush, okay? Then you have this sliding scale. The closer you get to 50%, the closer you're getting to about a 75, 80% probability that lek's going to persist. And the closer you get to 25, the closer it is to 0. You got this sliding scale. Once you go over 50% of that buffer, now you're above 80% and you're getting close to 90. Once you go above two-thirds or higher, you're practically at a probability of 100% or a 1.0. That lek is going to persist. That is the biggest issue with sage grouse. And we spend all this time working on, well, are there forbs here? Are there grasses here? Are there all these components when that's the issue is this 20-mile buffer around the lek and how much of that is sagebrush.
This 2/3 rule that Dave describes really helps me grasp just how much habitat sage grouse need to persist. Thinking about how regional groups of grouse require a 20-mile buffer around their lekking grounds really drives home the idea of the scale at which sage grouse management takes place. Sage grouse are truly unlike pheasant in this way. They need more than a quarter section of good habitat to survive. They need 20, 40, 50 plus miles of contiguous suitable habitat in order to exist.
Just a heads up, we did censor some of the dialogue to protect specific locations.
Okay, think about an elk. It might winter here, you have a hunting season, bam, it's 40, 50 miles over here, right? That's how sage grouse use the landscape, and that's what causes them, that's that persistence thing. I'll give you an example. We're doing a project, that L of Utah, right? And it's just past that crook of that L, okay? So we were up in that country, and we captured a female, we put a radio on her, she was just, we couldn't find her, so we did a flight, and we found her on a nest, and she was by the Idaho. That's 55 miles away. We caught her on a lek here, and she nested 55 miles from there. And what's interesting about sage grouse is you have a portion of the population, they might spend their whole life right in and around that lek. And then other parts of that population might make these, mid-sized movements. And then other parts may do these 50-mile, type of movements. And so, but we need that variation because some years it's advantageous to stay around the lek. Some years it's more advantageous to leave and be further away, spend that energy to be there. And so it's not that we just have one or the other. We need that variation to persist through time.
In leafy regions blessed with copious rains, we learn to measure the productive capacity of the soil by its natural vegetation. But this rule is almost wholly inapplicable here, for, notwithstanding its savage nakedness, scarce at all veiled by a sparse growth of sage, the desert soil of the Great Basin is as rich in the elements that in rainy regions rise and ripen into food as that of any other state in the Union. 1918, John Muir.
This story sits us in the Great Basin in the 21st century. But before today, the Great Basin shows fossil evidence of human habitation dating back to 12,000 BC. By 1869, the first railroad passed through and the settlement of the West was well underway. According to NASA, the Earth's crust in the Basin and Range Providence is gradually expanding, cracking into hundreds of faults as it thins. Over millions of years, land on one side of the faults rose, forming mountains, even as the land on the other side sank into basins.
The Greater Sage-Grouse's range stretches across the western United States and into Canada. This bird can be found from Washington to eastern Montana, all the way down to northwestern Colorado and eastern California. Although this bird is a sagebrush obligate, or a species that requires sagebrush to survive, not all lands covered in sagebrush are equal. The sage steppe of eastern Montana looks a lot different than the semi-desert sagelands found in Utah's Great Basin, which is where Dave Dahlgren's research takes place.
The Great Basin is an ecoregion and basically a watershed that has no outlet. So the Great Salt Lake is the kind of flagship terminus, Great Basin Lake. It was basically created by the historic or prehistorical Lake Bonneville, and that was an inland huge lake that covered most of Nevada, western side of Utah, and a little bit up into Oregon and maybe even Idaho. But basically anything that drains interior to either the Great Salt Lake or any of those other interior Salt Lake type areas, salty lakes type areas, is the Great Basin.
As a New Englander, sometimes I have a tough time grasping the sheer size of the public lands out west, and therefore the dynamics of their social impacts. When I think about ruffed grouse in New England, it's more about public access on private land like timberlands and the importance of state agencies, the public, and private landowner relations to keep those places freely open. So I have to ask, what percentage of the sage grouse population occurs on public lands?
From my understanding, across the sage-grouse's range, the majority of it is located on public lands, particularly on Bureau of Land Management, or BLM land. Utah specifically is about 70% public land. Its western portion is part of the Great Basin, and nearly 8 million acres of it is owned by the BLM alone. That's about 12,500 square miles.
All right, to be clear, that's bigger than the state of New Hampshire. So is all of that sage grouse habitat?
Kind of. According to the Cornell Lab of Ornithology's website, most of that area is included in the Greater Sage-Grouse's historic range. Today, sage-grouse occur mostly around the edges of Utah's borders, where the elevation is higher and there's more private lands. The Great Basin itself is not actually super great grouse habitat. As it turns out, sage grouse need more than just sagebrush to survive. They depend on perennial grasses and forbs that live between the sage. Sage grouse, especially hens, rely on these nutritious foods to stay healthy prior to the breeding season. During the brooding season, chicks rely on insects as a protein-rich food source. Insects are more strongly associated with areas with forbs and grasses than large swaths of sagebrush without these resources.
Grasses are probably more about cover. They don't eat much grass. Sage grouse don't. But I think the bigger thing that's probably more specific, and if you're not into this world, you may not know it. And if you think of a continuous line between like eastern Montana, and you come straight down into like southern Nevada. So instead of an east-west line, just tilt it across that. The variation in sagebrush systems and communities across that line is incredible. And yet this one species inhabits all of them. So when you get down to southern Nevada, or where I do a lot of work in southern Utah, you don't have a lot of grasses and forbs in those systems. In fact, one ecological term for it is semi-desert, sagebrush semi-desert. So it just doesn't have the grasses and forbs, or the potential to have grasses and forbs. Yet when you're up in that part of Montana, you may, the first time I visited, I was like, this isn't sage grouse habitat. Why would sage grouse live here? There's not enough sagebrush. And yet, there they were. I was finding them. So it's that incredible variation that that becomes challenging on how and what pristine habitat looks like in southern Nevada, southern Utah versus, northeastern Montana. Those are very different as far as what creates pristine habitat. I think the next biggest thing that comes to my mind, I talked earlier about this variation in habitat across the range, from more of a grassland with a few sagebrush in it up north to a semi-desert, as we move further southwest. I'm actually part of a project that's combined telemetry data across populations across that continuum. And we're looking at habitat selection now, and we're combining all that into one big data set. So we're really looking at that variation of habitat use based on where they're at. That wouldn't have been possible without, to do a habitat selection study, you have to have a ton of data. You have to have just thousands and thousands of points for the models to actually start to work their way through the assessment. And so it's not published yet, but it's on its way to being published. So that's my next biggest thing. We've learned that we need basically focus areas for sage grouse. It's kind of a triage approach. Like, where do we have them? Where are they good? Let's hold on to those, and then we can start to play a little bit differently with maybe areas that they're not as highly likely to persist. And that's kind of been the approach to sage grouse conservation so far.
Conservation groups call it a last-minute Christmas present from the Bush administration to the oil and gas industry. A plan to auction the drilling rights to some of the most wild and scenic areas left in America. 110,000 acres of red rock public land in Utah.
Developments on efforts to save a bird from possible extinction. Today, the Obama administration decided the greater sage grouse does not require endangered species status. The announcement came today.
Challenging Trump-era oil and gas leases in Utah. The Southern Utah Wilderness Alliance is challenging decisions made by the Bureau of Land Management for 2018 and 2019 to distribute nearly 200 gas leases on more than 200,000 acres of public land, most of which are located in eastern Utah. The lawsuit also arguing
Pristine habitat in Utah looks a lot different than pristine habitat in Montana. In Utah, sagebrush ecosystems are up against both naturally occurring and anthropogenic threats. However, not all of these issues necessarily have negative impacts. In the next part of this episode, we'll explore the human-centric issues affecting sage grouse, which is livestock, energy, and fences.
Let's use agriculture as our first example of a contentious conservation issue that may not necessarily be as bad as it seems.
Livestock grazing is this huge issue that people talk about all the time. If you read an article about sage grouse, you'll hear about grazing. But there are like that many studies, 0, that show actual detriments from grazing to sage grouse. I had the highest chick survival reported in the literature. Over 50% of the sage grouse chicks lived. That was all in the presence of grazing going on. And in fact, I saw some hens that I can't say this is like totally data driven and analyzed, but they almost seeked out livestock, especially cows, and they wanted their brood in there. And I was like, why are they doing that? And then I realized if a coyote comes around, those livestock chase that thing out, lickety split, right? I'm like, oh man, maybe there is some advantage there. If you look across the range of sage grouse, almost all the large intact populations, they're almost all grazed. It's like 87% overlap of grazing in our sage grouse populations. I've come to see livestock on the whole is much more compatible with game birds than what we might think. Does overgrazing happen? Yeah, but it's usually very localized. What we forget about when we see a local area that has been overused, that also means there's other areas that weren't overused. And we forget about that.
When we think of oil and gas out west, for me, the first thing that comes to mind is habitat fragmentation. But are oil pads occurring at high enough densities to be truly negatively impacting Great Basin sage grouse?
The energy thing's interesting. So there's been some research that's shown it's not until you hit a certain well density that you start to negatively impact sage grouse. So there is a well density we can be at that's lighter. And I can't remember off the top of my head exactly what that density was per area. But the research did show that until you get to this density, then it's not impacting the bird. And so, directional drilling then can become a solution to that kind of issue. But the biggest issue with sage grouse overall is scale. For me in my career, communicating scale with sage grouse has been the biggest challenge, whether I'm dealing with the public or even some of the conservation organizations or agencies. It's just trying to understand that scale, because sage grouse use the landscape like an elk uses the landscape. It's huge tracts of land that need to be in contiguous sagebrush for that sage grouse to have a high likelihood of persistence.
I would really like to emphasize that energy development can coexist with sound sage grouse management practices. But when greed gives our environmental issues a back seat, that's where the wheels come off. Science-based management is not a zero-sum game. Follow the science and we can all take a victory lap. These things always come back to habitat, habitat, habitat.
I was doing some research down mountain in southern Utah, and I had another grad student doing his PhD with me. He was doing some prairie dog research, and he was putting in, so it's Utah prairie dog, it's an endangered species down there, and he was putting in these little paddocks using different levels of cattle grazing to see if he could affect prairie dog use and vegetation and communities and stuff. He kept telling me, he's like, because we put new fencing in that had never been there, and one of the fences ran up and over this big ridge, and he's like, I keep seeing sage grouse hits on the fence, and it looks mostly like male feathers and stuff. He said, you need to run up there and see if there's a lek there. This area was just way off the beaten path. It was a 2-track for miles just to get there. And so I finally had time one spring, and I went up there and I came over the hill, and there was 208 males dancing on that. We found a lek, one of the biggest leks on the mountain, actually.
If you've heard of sage grouse management, you've probably heard of the white reflectors being installed on the top wire of a barbed wire fence out west. Dave was actually a part of the initial effort to install them, and since that initial installation, he's reflected on whether or not all that time spent on the wire was actually worth it.
NRCS had a big movement and lots of markers and worked with private lands. And what I liked about NRCS's approach is they modeled the landscape and said, where are we at highest risk? Well, around leks and around wintering areas. And they really focused on those. And I think that was the appropriate way to go. I will add, however, okay? It's just like a hunting mortality. Is it really going to affect the population? Mortality has to occur at a certain level before it starts to be additive to the population and hurt the population. And so with all our marked birds out there, were we seeing fence collisions actually at a rate that was hurting the population? Not that I know of, definitely not in my work. I think it was a good faith effort, and I think it definitely saved some birds. And I was all for it. We're doing the best we can with what we have. But is fence marking the answer? No, I don't think it's the whole answer. But there's no silver bullet to any of this, right? I think it was good, and I did a lot of leopard chicken work in Kansas, and we marked fences where we thought there might be an issue. I thought that was a worthwhile effort as well. But one of my things with that is don't take the focus off the habitat. That sometimes these things tend to lead us, like we're trying to save everything, right? And we're trying to do all this, and then all of a sudden we forget, no, we need more connected habitat more than we need markers on fences, right? And that's where I start to have issues with some of those kind of things.
In the number of individual trees and extent of range, this curious little conifer surpasses all the others combined. Nearly every mountain in the state is planted with it, from near the base to a height of from 8,000 to 9,000 feet above the sea. Tens of thousands of acres occur in one continuous belt. Indeed, viewed comprehensively, the entire state seems to be pretty evenly divided into mountain ranges covered with nut pines and plains covered with sage. Now, a swath of pines stretching from north to south. Now a swath of sage, the one black, the other grey, one severely level, the other sweeping on complacently over ridge and valley and lofty crowning dome. 1918, John Muir.
Conifers are an interesting subject because there's another species, the pinyon jay, that relies on pinyon juniper, or PJ, ecosystems. As far as wildlife managers can currently tell, managing for both sage grouse and pinyon jays is kind of a catch-22.
What's funding most of my research right now are these conifer issues with sagebrush, because conifer issues have the pinyon jay component to them. And so we have this, I call it the cage match, right? You got the sage grouse, sagebrush thing creeping here. Then you got the conifer, pinyon juniper woodlands, and the pinyon jay, and they're coming to this head, right? Who's going to win that conservation fight? Because it seems like there's no winner. We're looking at sage grouse, we're looking at pinyon jays, and we're looking at songbirds, sagebrush songbirds specifically, all at the same time. Because can we find those places where we can look at cost benefits, where conifers has come out of the hills, out of the slopes where they belong? So you can think of it as an ecological site. What should that site really be? They've come and encroached into the sagebrush, which starts to take habitat away from sage grouse and other sagebrush obligates. And yet you have this pinyon jay that's an obligate to the pinyon juniper woodlands. What do we do with that? And what's interesting is pinyon jays have been declining while pinyon juniper woodlands have been expanding. So it's like, oh, wait a minute. I've been the only sage grouse person working on some of those pinyon jay groups. It's been interesting to try to see it from both sides. But encroachment is a big deal. It's a bigger deal in the Great Basin than it is in any other system as far as taking over sagebrush and really reducing it. I did some research. We published this back in about 2017 in Northwest Utah, where we had a whole bunch of conifer treatments come in. Most of them were bull hogged. That's that big drum that with the carbide teeth, and you just goes, it's awesome to see. But you go to the tree and it spreads all this debris of the tree around, which actually creates a nice seed bed for other things that you're doing. And we did that up in this area, and we found, this is where it gets really interesting. We found sage grouse nest survival actually increased with treatments. Sage grouse brood survival, so we had radio mark grouse and we were following them. Brood survival increased with treatments, but it didn't just increase in the treatment. It increased in intact sagebrush next to the treatment. So sage grouse their space matters, right? And the more open space you have, open being treeless, the better it is for the sage grouse. So just by creating that bigger contiguous space, then the grouse benefited. So even if they weren't in the treatment, they still benefited by being associated with the treatment. And we were able to show that with some of our data, which I thought was this really interesting effect that it was having out there. What I don't know is, what did we do to pinyon jays while we're doing all that? I don't know.
What we've learned so far is space. Space is critical for sage grouse. That 2/3 rule that Dave taught us about is such a good example of why we need public lands. So this is here long after we're gone.
We have explored the challenges of man, from energy to fences all the way to nature with conifer. But the Great Basin, a semi-desert environment, has bigger threats that could permanently alter the future of sage grouse in the blink of an eye. Threats not so easily overcome.
In the next episode, we will explore these issues and take a deeper look at Dave's work, because not only is he an accomplished scientist, but his lifelong love for hunting and dogs intersects with sage grouse research.
And we will learn, what is a more effective research tool, a pointing dog or a GPS transmitter?
One size doesn't fit all. We can't manage all sage grouse the same because of this diversity of habitat and community types. That's what we're trying to understand. You know, the BLM has to have one big plan that moves forward for sage grouse. So does the Forest Service. So do the states. And so how do we manage to meet those needs in those different areas when they have different community types? That's kind of probably the closest thing I am to the edge, the tip of the spear.
If you want to learn more about the pinyon jay, search pinyon jay on our website, projectupland.com, where you can read an article by Clint Wierick of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service about ongoing research.
If you enjoyed this episode, consider subscribing to our Patreon. There, you will find links to resources we used to create this episode, behind-the-scenes interviews, and other content to keep nerding out on birds. As a small business and independent storytellers, your support means everything to us. After all, these are your stories.
This episode was produced by myself, Gabby Zeldambide, AJ DeRosa, and Jennifer Wapensky. The editing of this episode was done by myself and AJ DeRosa. Special thanks to Associate Professor Rangeland Wildlife Extension Specialist at Utah State University, Dave Dahlgren.